welcome back to The Joy of Sewing. We're building on our sewing skills, and now we are going to learn about the difference between gathers and pleats. And this is important because some people intermix those terms, and you want to make sure that you're applying the right thing to your project because that might make or break what you're working on. Okay, so I have just a pre-sewn sample here, and this is just one version of a pleat. And see how the fabric is sewn at the top, and then the fabric just sort of falls open at the bottom. You might recognize this on skirts. Men's trousers would have pleats on the front if they're not a flat front fit, and other places on clothing and different projects. It's just a way to make a flat fabric conform or fit around a three-dimensional object. The other example is gathers. Let's pull this piece over here. And gathers are common all over in sewing. You might be putting gathers in a sleeve. You might put these in a skirt. You might be gathering some sort of detail that you're going to attach to a garment or a craft project or even a quilt. There's a lot of manipulation of fabric that you can do simply by gathering and ruching, there's another term for it, that up. Now, when it comes to gathers, there's a word that we use called ratio, and that is the amount of gathers per the amount of fabric. I'm going to loosen this just a little bit, and basically how much fabric that you put into whatever area that you're fitting is going to determine how full that garment is going to be. So for example, I just loosened up the stitches that I have on here, and you can see how the gathers spread apart. Now, if I wanted a really, really tight gather, I might pull, and I'll show you how to make these in just a minute, but I'm going to pull the fabric together by pulling those strings, and see how now all of a sudden the fabric is gathered up and there's much more bulk in a smaller area. As you're doing a project, this might come in, or where you're going to apply this might be affected by how much fabric. So for example, if you have a fuller figure, you're probably not going to want lots and lots of gathers in there because you're adding bulk on top of the body. However, if you have a really lightweight fabric, you could get by with many more fabrics because it's much finer. So just know that the weight of your fabric and how tight you pull those gathering threads is going to determine the overall look of your project. Let's go ahead and make these on our sewing machine. And I would recommend just practicing this once or twice before you do this on an actual project. When you're going to do, let's start with our gathers, you want to change the stitch length setting. And I have this actually all the way up to a 5, which is as high as it will go on this machine. And this is a heavier fabric. It has a little more body to it. So that's a good length. If I have something a little lighter, maybe I'm going to go just a little bit shorter. But not necessarily the tiniest stitch on my machine. It needs to be long. And then we're just using a regular straight stitch. I'm going to put my foot down and I'm going to stitch. I'm just going to keep my presser foot even with the edge of the fabric. And I'm not back stitching at the beginning of where the gathers are at, and I'm not going to back stitch at the end. Instead, and I'm not even going to cut my thread, I'm going to hit the needle up button, lift my presser foot, and I'm going to pull straight back. And then there's a little cutter on the side of my machine. I'm going to cut the thread. And see, I have a nice long thread tail. To create the gathers, I need to have something to hang on to. But we're not ready yet. We want to put at least one more row of stitching in there. Reference your pattern or whatever instructions you have for your project, and it's probably going to tell you how many rows of stitching to put on your project and how far apart they should be. The gathering stitches will always fall inside the seam that you're sewing so that you don't see them on the outside of your project. All right, needle up. Presser foot up, pull straight back, cut the threads. So we now have a double row of stitching. It's nice and flat. I'm going to go over here, and you can do this from the top or bottom. And I'm going to start pulling, and I usually take my right hand and I put, I hold those threads kind of taut, and then I pretty much pull the fabric like a clothesline. I'm not really pulling the thread. I'm actually sliding the fabric across that clothesline in essence of the 2 rows of stitches that we have right there. And you can see how that's now starting to cinch up our fabric. The nice thing about a double row of stitching, and sometimes you'll even do 3 rows, but it gives you a little bit of support in case you accidentally break one of them, you still have another. It also helps to distribute the fullness of the gathers between the 2 rows of stitching. So when you do go to sew this to something else, you're not bunching up the fabric, and the gathers are going to fall nicely into your seam. So that really is how gathers are done. Let's take a look at the pleats. Let's revisit that. You can see how the pleat has a much flatter look to it. So if you have a fuller figure or maybe a curve where you don't want bulk, a pleat is going to be a little bit cleaner line because it's much flatter, but you're still manipulating the fabric just in a little different way. I'm going to pin a couple pleats out here just to kind of show you some different options. And these things are marked on whatever patterns you use. Some pleats will literally be folds. And let's just put a pin in there. And you might literally have a single pleat. You might have multiple pleats. And I'm just eyeballing these for illustration purposes, but your pattern will have marks that you join together. And if I were to pin that, you can now see how I have a double pleat and so on. So that would be maybe a certain type of pleat. Other pleats bring the points together, like in my sample. We'll just kind of hold that there, where you would stitch across the top and then the fabric's going to fall open at the bottom. And then you have box pleats on the top where it's the same formation, but the pleat sits on the fabric, on the top of the fabric. So when you sew across it, you have a little bit more of an outer shape to the pleat. So simply by how you fold your fabric, you really actually can create a lot of different design details on a lot of different projects just by putting some simple folds in your project. I would encourage you to play around with that and experiment and see what you can come up with and how that looks. The other thing about pleats is that you can have combinations. You can also have different sizes. Let's go ahead and put this under the machine. Normally pleats are just stitched across at the top. So we're going to anchor that. I don't even need to back stitch. I'm just stitching straight across. There's nothing really fancy about what you do when you stitch across there. Let's just take a look. It really is just like an extra hand. It's holding it together so you can remove your pins. And when you're ready to attach this to something else, you have a nice pleat. Your seam allowance is going to fall right there. And then that's what your pleat is going to look like on your garment or whatever you're sewing. Thanks for joining me on The Joy of Sewing. Join me next time as we talk about tucks and darts.